What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back with another Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, I have assembled a wonderful recap for you. We'll be going over tons of cards, of course graded cards from Journey Together, tons of high-end grails, and we will also be going over the sale of a certain Pikachu Van Gogh promo card that I believe hit a new record price as a PSA 10. We're going to go over why, so stick around to the very end. You're going to love today's recap. Folks, I once again want to encourage you to go check out the 100% Pokemon auction block happening this weekend on fanaticscollect.com. And just like last week, there are even more beautiful Pokemon TCG Grails available in this auction. Plenty of PSA, BGS, and CGC graded cards up for grabs, stemming from many different generations of the Pokemon TCG. And it's not just all Grails on this auction block. There are actually some cards on here that you might be able to get for an absolute steal. And if you win any high value cards, don't forget to submit them to the Fanatics Collect Vault so that you don't have to pay any unnecessary sales tax. Numerous amounts of first edition WotC cards, E-Series cards, tons of Gold Star cards. A direct link to the auction block will be in the description of this video. Thank you so much for checking it out. Alright folks, let's jump into this week's recap, starting off with a couple of master sets. That's right, we don't normally cover master sets on these recaps, but today we're going to do it. Here is a master set of Crown Zenith, 100% done, sold for $1,086. And then here we saw two complete master sets of 151. This one here sold for $1,225. This one here sold for $1,422. So what do you think? Are those pretty good deals for master sets? You tell me. On to a couple of more graded cards from Journey Together. Here we have a PSA 10 illustration rare Ionos Kilowattrel that sold for $207 this week. Here is an illustration rare Articuno that sold as a PSA 10 for $315, along with this Ends Zoroark EX special illustration rare that sold also as a PSA 10 for $415. And then here we saw the further decline of the Lily's Clefairy EX SIR that sold this week for $780. On to this lot of 147 Gold Star Greninja cards that sold for a grand total of $1,698. And it's worth noting that none of these Gold Stars are sealed, so I mean, it's a Pro Obscene auction, so your guess is as good as mine of what condition these cards are in, but that's, I think, around $12, $13 a card, I think. I'm not sure, but definitely a bit of a premium for a lot like this. Let me know what you think about it. Here we have a lot of 10 PSA 10 Unigaba Evolution cards that sold for $990 this week. Seems like a really good deal to me. Up next, we have a lot of cards that came through from the black and white era that we hardly ever see. Here is a PSA 9 Darkrai EX from Dark Explorers that sold for $361. Here's a Kyogre EX, also from Dark Explorers, and also a PSA 9 that sold for $675. Here also from Dark Explorers was this Groudon EX full art that sold as a PSA 9 for $875. Here from Dragons Exalted we have this Superior in PSA 10 that sold for $2,264 this week. It's also worth noting this is a secret rare card from the set, so keep that in mind. Here also from Dragons Exalted was a PSA 8 Rayquaza EX that sold for $320. And then we saw this Rayquaza also from Dragons Exalted. This is the regular holo version that sold for $9,500 as a PSA 10. Yowza. Up next, we have this PSA 8 Full Art Gengar EX from Phantom Forces that sold for $393. This card is an absolute powerhouse, no matter really what grade it is, let alone a PSA 10. Here we have this card. This is a simplified Chinese Pikachu card. One I haven't seen before, sold as a PSA 10 for $879 this week. A couple of very expensive Japanese cards. Here is a Black Label Misty's Favor that sold for $4,050 this week, along with this Collection Moon Full Art Lily in PSA 10 that sold for $5,665. And up next, folks, these are not auctions. These were best offer accepted sales, but I thought they were very noteworthy. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Full Art Mario Pikachu that was listed for $15,000. Ended up having a best offer accepted price of $13,000. for this card. Now this card has been selling pretty high as a PSA 10 as well, knocking on the door of $10,000, most recently selling as a PSA 10 for $9,750. And the only other available CGC 10 pristine copy of this card is listed at about $22,000 US. And then here we saw a PSA 10 Pikachu Van Gogh promo card that was listed for $1,500, ended up having a best offer accepted price of $1,200 for this very particular copy. Now this was a verified paid for sale, folks, and you might be thinking to yourself like I was, this card's been going in auction for $700 to $800. Why would you pay $1,200 for this card? Well, people want what they want. I mean, I think in this case, it was the cert number that was really desirable to this buyer. So there you go, folks. $1,200 for a Pikachu Van Gogh promo. Up next, we have the vintage portion of our video. Here is a PSA 10 First Edition Nidoking from Base Set that sold this week for $5,937. Here we have an unlimited raw Lugia from Neo Genesis, sold for $410, while a raw First Edition copy sold for $1,275. Here we have a CGC 10 First Edition Shining Charizard from Neo Destiny, sold for $8,200 this week, while the PSA 10 copy sold for a whopping $16,601. Here we have a PSA 9 Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection that sold for $4,850. Here we have a BGS 9.5 Gengar from Skyridge that sold for $3,850. Here is a CGC 10 Gem Mint Crystal Charizard from Skyridge that sold for $11,000 this week. We saw a ton of old school EX cards come by. Here is a Gyarados EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold for $1,347. Here is a Blastoise EX that sold for $2,400. A Mewtwo EX from Ruby and Sapphire sold for $2,850. And then we saw several bangers from EX Team Rocket Returns. Here is a PSA 10 Reverse Holo Meowth that sold for $1,026. Here is a Rockets Hitmonchan EX that sold for $2,347. A Rockets Moltres EX sold for $2,391. And then again for $2,447. Here is a Rockets Entei EX that sold for $2,550. And then here is a PSA 9 Rockets Mewtwo EX that sold for $2,700, while the PSA 10 copy sold for $8,800. And let's not forget this Rockets Snorlax EX that sold as a PSA 10 for $9,100. Up next, we saw a Tag 9 Gold Star Trico from EX Team Rocket Returns. This card sold for $3,100, while a PSA 10 copy of this card sold for $10,099. From EX Unseen Forces, we saw this PSA 10 Ho-Oh EX that sold for $2,280, while this PSA 10 Lugia EX sold for $9,700. And then here we have a Salamence EX from Deoxys that sold for $1,530 this week. Up next, we have a PSA 9 Gold Star Gyarados from EX Holon Phantoms that sold for $4,450, along with this Gold Star Celebi, which got a PSA 10 and sold for $5,100. Here we have a PSA 9 Gold Star Charizard from EX Dragon Frontiers that sold for $7,600. And then we also saw a Tag 9 Gold Star Charizard that sold for an even $9K. Up next, folks, is this insane sale of the Glaceon Level X from Majestic Dawn. Here is a raw copy that sold for $196, while the PSA 10 example of this card sold for $10,600. I think you could argue this is the most expensive Glaceon card of all time. We also saw this PSA 9 Snorlax Level X that sold for $654 US. And then lastly, for our graded cards on eBay, we saw this PSA 9 Plasma Storm Charizard card that sold for $1,120. And there was a PSA 10 that came through, but unfortunately, it had to get relisted, so we can't go over that sale, but maybe next week. And then I saw one booster box come by that was very notable. It's this Unlimited Team Rocket booster box that sold for $16,100 this week with writing on it and everything. So makes me wonder what a first edition box would go for in today's market. Up next is the Fanatics Collect weekly auction block. Here is a PSA 10 Reverse Holo Venusaur from Legendary Collection sold for $2,760. And we saw several base set Shadowless cards come by in PSA 10. Here's another Venusaur, sold for $3,360. Another one sold for $3,480. Here's a Hitmonchan that sold for $2,520. The Mewtwo sold for $4,200. Alakazam sold for $4,440, while the Clefairy sold for $4,800. And then we also saw a Shadowless Raichu from base set sell for $6,900 this week. And let's not forget this PSA 10 First Edition Red Cheeks Pikachu from base set that sold for $5,280. From Team Rocket set, we saw this PSA 10 No Holo Error Dragonite card, sold for $3,600. Here is another First Edition Dark Blastoise. We've been seeing this guy come through week after week for some reason. This sold for $4,800. Here is a PSA 10 Japanese Shining Gyarados that sold for $7,500, along with this PSA 10 Full Art Team Rocket card that sold for $9,900. And then here is a PSA 10 Gem Mint Giovanni Scheme that sold for $13,200. And then lastly, on the Fanatics weekly auction block was this Shadowless base set Charizard in PSA 10, sold for $66,000. And then we're going to finish off this auction recap with a couple of sales from Alt. Here is a Black Label Japanese Gengar VMAX that sold for $5,981. Here is the Rainbow Rare Charizard GX from Burning Shadows, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,837. And this card, I swear, it's been sitting in limbo at this price for years now, selling around the $3,000 mark. I think it got as high as $4,000 at one point, but it's been sitting at this price point for years and years. I don't know what's going on with this card. It's just been pretty stagnant. Up next, we have the no rarity symbol Japanese base set starters, all in PSA 10. Here is the Squirtle, sold for $1,440. The no rarity symbol Bulbasaur sold for $1,451. And Charmander did the best out of all three, selling for $2,508. Here is a first edition Umbreon from Neo Discovery. The Umbreon rookie card sold as a PSA 10 for $9,823. And then last but certainly not least was this PSA 8 Japanese first place gold trophy card that sold for $314,707 this week. That's all I got today, folks. Let me know what you thought of this week's auctions in the comments. I will be reading through them. I look forward to hearing from you. And that's all I got. I'll catch you in my next one.